Some of you might have noticed by looking at the schedule of our week that the architecture, so to say, of the summer university is like an economics class. So what you get within a week is a full-scale introductory course in Austrian Economics with some optional courses at the end of the week that are a little bit more advanced. And so we start off by just considering the most fundamental phenomena first, or might say the most generally valid phenomena first, and then move on to ever more specific problems. Now what you have heard in the lectures this morning, as far as economics was concerned, was this lecture on value, utility, and price. And we have to complement this now by going a little bit, considering more specific problems, the case of production. So the title of my lecture could have been Economics of Production, which is what we will consider. And the division of labor is precisely an important case, but it will not be the only case that we will analyze in our lecture. So what I plan to do with you now is first to go through certain general features or general law that come into play as far as the economics of production are concerned. And then we will consider two techniques, or we might say two strategies, through which the physical productivity of human labor can be increased. One of these strategies or techniques is the division of labor, and the other one is savings and capital accumulation. Okay, so in the history of civilization, of course, these were the most two important inventions. It's almost more important than the invention of the wheel, various other gimmicks, the computer, and so on. Two basic ways by which human beings can improve their well-being, can improve their lot, have risen out of a state of misery and created civilization were capital accumulation and the division of labor. But again, in order to understand how precisely these two mechanisms work, we have to consider production in general. So first of all, then, let us consider that human action, or we might say human choice, takes always place in a context. And this context is a given context. Right? And this context is largely a context is physically determined. Right? So we're acting in a physical context. And as all physical things extended through time and space, they're constrained by what we call the laws of nature. Okay? Now, as far as production is concerned, there are two important laws of nature that we need to consider, and since we have only an hour, we will not be able to do much more. The first law is that production takes place in time, so there is inbuilt, it's a law of nature that, well, you've got to do one damn thing after the other, right? Certain things first, and then other things. And the second law that we will consider is are the laws of return. Okay. Let me first of all define what economists mean by production. So production is the conscious transformation of nature with the purpose of creating a new state of affairs that is considered by the acting person to be more valuable than the state of affairs that would have existed in the absence of this transformation of nature. Okay? That's a conscious transformation of nature that for the acting person aims at a state of affairs that is for this person considered to be more valuable than the state of affairs that would have existed if he had not so acted. All right, so if again the principle of subjective value here plays, economists don't pretend to be able to tell one thing was a productive act, the other one not. If we apply economic law, sometimes it's difficult to identify acts of production because we don't know always or necessarily the aims of the acting person. Sometimes we have to guess them. Sometimes we are able to ask the person, why did you do this? And then he might tell us why he did certain things. In other cases, it is more difficult. So this conscious transformation of nature is extended in time, and as a consequence, so we have various steps of action involved, or there is a certain order of of acting imposed by the fact that action has to take place in time. In order to produce a pen, right, we need to have various ingredients. We need to transform plastic in a certain manner. We need to have a mine, right, with which we will be able to write. This is metal and so on. There's a little spring. So in order to compose all these elements as the final act of the production process, we need to have produced the spring before. And in order to produce the spring, well, we need to have transformed copper in a certain way. In order to transform this copper in a certain way to create the spring, we might need actually a machine. So before we actually can produce the spring, we need to invest time to produce a machine and so on. So we have, therefore, various acts extended in time and connected in a process that we call the process of production. And we might illustrate this by a simple flash. Work of art. Well, I forgot to say that I'm in the line of a famous tradition of German artists. One of my ancestors was Lukas Cranach. It's actually a misspelling. It was Lukas Hülsmann, but okay. So we have here the last point of time, which I designated as 0, which is the point of time at which our product is finished, which the final consumer's goods is ready. And so we call the stage of production reaching from here from -1 to 0, we call this the first order production process. And the good that is being produced, namely the consumer's good, is the first order good. And so the preceding stages of production and the preceding products that are being produced are then called the higher stages of production, right, and the higher goods. So a higher good is not something that is ethically superior or somehow more beautiful or whatever, just designates a certain position in time as in comparison to something that comes later. One shouldn't accord maybe too much importance to vocabulary, so the essential thing that you need to retain, to memorize, is that in economics the distinction between sooner and later is important. So some goods are logically need to be produced earlier than other goods in a production process. And we call this vocabulary higher goods as compared to lower goods or first order goods is a specifically Austrian vocabulary, Austrian terminology that has been introduced by Karl Menger, of whom you have heard this morning in his 1871 Principles of Economics. What we might simply call these higher products by the more commonly used term of factors of production. So we will call these here production of factors of production. And only in this stage here do we produce a consumer's good, only in the last stage. Now, any act of production, whether it concerns a factor of production or a consumer's good, is determined by the law of returns, sometimes also referred to as the laws, plural, of returns. But we'll just be concerned today with the most essential version, and not in particular we won't have the time to deal with fallacious variants thereof. So what is meant by the laws of return, what is meant by it is that the production or the use of additional quantities of factors of production don't yield commonly an equiproportional or proportional amount of product. So consider the case of a farmer who is planting wheat, and so he has various ingredients, right? So he has his human labor, there's land, he uses seed, and he uses fertilizer, okay? And as a result, a combined result of all these factors of production has a certain quantity of wheat that is being produced. Now, what the law of return says is that if we increase the quantity of any of these factors of production, the result that we gain thereby will decrease. This we will always be able, in most cases, be able to increase the overall result, but not at a proportional rate, but at an underproportional rate. And this we commonly illustrate by the following diagram. So we have here the quantity of the overall product, Q. We have X, which is the quantity of the additional factor of production that we use. And so we pin down a relationship between overall product and the use of this one factor of production, given the quantities of all other factors of production. Okay? So in the example that I've used, so I assume that the quantity of land doesn't vary, the amount of labor doesn't vary, the amount of seed that I've used doesn't vary. The only thing that I vary is one other factor, namely, for example, fertilizer. And as you see, what the law of returns says is that by increasing the quantity of fertilizer, I can increase my overall product, but at ever slower margins. And finally, I reach a point, a maximum, beyond which I cannot increase the overall product. And then actually I've considered here the case, which is not necessarily given, but often given, in which the additional use of the factor will actually decrease the overall result. And it can, I could have drawn this further down here, it can actually go so far that the overall result becomes negative. Right? If you just cover your field with 1 cubic meter of fertilizer, it's very unlikely that the seeds will come through, right? Because there's no sun that can pertain to the seeds. Right? So if you overdo it, you will create a negative result. And so this is the curve PP, physical product. Okay. And the dotted line here is the curve of the marginal physical product that results from my production process. And you see the marginal physical product is just 0 at the point where I reach the maximum of my physical product. Now, again, what you need to retain here is that in the case of the law of returns, we're considering just the variation of one factor of production. If we increase the other factors of production, we obtain the following thing. So this is the situation before. Now let's say if I vary the amount of labor that I use to cultivate my field, I will get the following shift. You see my curve shifts up. So for the same amount of fertilizer here, with a bigger amount of labor, I get a higher result. I get more wheat. I can harvest more wheat. And the same thing holds true for all other considerations. So rather than considering the use of fertilizer, of course, I can hold the quantity of fertilizer used as constant, and I just increase the amount of land being used, or the amount of seeds. And I get the same result. So increasing these other factors of production will shift upward my curve of returns. The important thing then that we see here is that in any case, so even if we increase the other factors of production, we always have a limitation. Right? We always have a maximum. That is the essential message of the law of returns. There always is, for any combination of factors of production, there always is a maximum. beyond which I cannot go. So I'm in my action, in my choices, constrained by this law of nature. And it is a law of nature which we might explain on a metaphysical level by the fact that all things are limited. Right? So the productive power inherent in all things is limited, and therefore can only generate a limited amount. Right? So at some point there must be a maximum, and if I'm smart, I will come close to the maximum. If I'm a little less instructed and enlightened about the laws of nature, well, I will fall short of this maximum. But that doesn't concern us. So for us, what is important is human action is constrained, and production in particular is constrained by this law of nature. And the essential aspect is that we have a maximum. Oh, my hand that was left over there. And this limit. I'm also a fakir. Some German fakirs, magicians. Yeah, so this limitation I also often call it's a bottleneck, right? So if you try to get water as quickly as possible out of a bottle, well, you're constrained by the diameter of the bottleneck. The larger is the bottleneck, the quicker you get the water out of the bottle. Now, production, or the economics of production, is largely concerned with the question how we can increase actually this bottleneck. That is, with the question how we can shift upward this curve, right? And we will see indeed that the basic mechanism in the two strategies that I talked about, savings and capital accumulation on the one hand and the division of labor on the other hand, is always the same. In both cases, what is involved ultimately is an upward shift of this curve. And this is what makes us more productive, which makes that, well, primitive labor is not characterized by the fact, well, some people are stupid or so, but that their output per unit of labor, per hour worked, for example, is just much smaller than the output that we can realize today. But before we come there, we need one additional element. At least that's an element that will facilitate our exposition. And this is the so-called production possibility frontier. It's another curve that is fairly widely used and that those of you who have studied economics know already. But so I will just derive the curve for you. So consider the following two cases of the law of returns. So we have the production of butter on the one hand, on the left, and the production of guns on the other hand. Fairly popular example among economists. You have to make ultimately a trade-off, right? You can either be more pacifist or more militarist. It cannot be the same thing at the same time. You've got to make a choice. The more butter you produce, the less guns you can produce, and the other way around. But in order to understand this, we need to consider that so both the production of butter and the production of guns are constrained by the law of returns, and that there is one factor of production that is needed for both production processes, and that is obviously labor. Right? And labor is indeed the one factor of production that is present in all production processes, which follows, as those of you who are philosophically inclined, which follows from the very definition of production. Right? Production is the conscious transformation by a human being of nature. So in all acts in which nature is just transformed without the intervention of a human being, we wouldn't talk of production. It just falls outside of our definition. So necessarily, by our definition, in all acts of labor, we have, in all acts of production, we have the factor labor involved. And thereby, there exists a connectivity between all production processes. And to illustrate this, we can consider the following diagram. So what I've done here, I've created a diagram with 4 quadrants. And in this quadrant here, I've simply transposed this diagram. Right? So I've just turned it around and pulled it a little bit down. And I've transposed this diagram into this quadrant. Okay? So far that's all that I've done. And as a consequence then we get two new quadrants that are not yet filled out, that I will fill out now. One is this here, which we have labor on both axes. And the fourth quadrant, and this is the most interesting one, that will give us the PPF, the production possibility frontier, in which we have the relationship that exists between butter and guns as a consequence of the two production processes being connected by labor. Okay, so how does this connection work? Well, the connection works by the fact that labor is limited in time, right? So even if I put myself under various efficient drugs and so on, I will at most be able to travel, to work 24 hours a day. Okay, not more than that. And if we forget about the use of drugs and various other stimulants, it will be considerably less. If we take other factors into consideration, like age and so on, so I'm an old guy, workday never lasts more than 5 hours. Right? And as a consequence of this limitation, then we get what economists call a budget constraint, right? So the total amount of labor that I can use is, let's say, 5 hours. This is my labor, right? So this thing, and 5 hours here. Okay. So I can either invest all of my labor in the production of guns, or I can invest all of my labor in the production of butter. Or I can produce a combination of butter and guns. Depending on which combination I use, I get a certain amount of guns. So we have this point. If I invest all my labor in the production of butter, I get this point. And if I take an intermediate combination, for example here, this one, I get this point. And this point, and they coincide here. Okay, and if I divide my labor in the following way, I get this point and this point here, and I can now connect them. Okay, so I've constructed just 4 points, and I can do this for any point that is on this x. Okay, and I get something like a curve of the following shape. Okay, so this is my curve, the curve that represents the relationship that exists between the production of butter and the production of guns, by virtue of the fact that I need labor for both production processes, and I call this then the PPF, production possibility frontier. And it is this curve that we can use for or further considerations. The important thing is, again, the limitation. At any point of time, I cannot go for physical reasons. I cannot go beyond this curve. Right? I can choose, if I'm very efficient, smart decision maker, I will manage to realize a combination of butter and guns that is on the frontier. Okay, therefore it's called a frontier. And if I'm less efficient, well, I will realize some other point that is within the frontier. So I can realize all these combinations, but I cannot, for physical reasons, attain a point that is beyond the frontier. That's why it's called a frontier. Okay. Now, with this in mind, we can now again restate our initial question. The question is, well, how can we make production more, the use of human labor more productive? It's the one factor of production that we need in all production processes. The question is, how can we increase the efficiency of human labor? How can we increase the physical product per unit of labor, that is per hour worked? That's the basic question. and I've given you the answers already, or at least in general, the basic answer is we can increase physical productivity by the division of labor, by savings and capital accumulation, and by a third technique too, but which I will not consider in my lecture today, which is innovation. Innovation pertaining in particular to technology and to the organization of human labor. And through these two techniques, capital accumulation on the one hand, division of labor on the other hand, I can increase the limitations, okay? I can diminish the limitations on my physical productivity. I can enlarge the bottleneck imposed by nature on the productivity of my labor. Now let's consider the case of savings first, and savings in a primitive economy. The most essential setting is the Crusoe economy. So you have just one human being, and if we are romantically inclined, we consider him being on an island with coconuts and birds flying around. It's not that encountered any Friday or Monday or whatever. And so the question for our Crusoe then is, how can he increase by savings and capital accumulation, how can he increase the physical productivity of his labor? And basically what he does, what he needs to do in order to increase his physical productivity is to do this, what we considered before, right? He needs to shift upwards the return curve for his labor, and the only way to do this is to produce or increase the amount of the other factors of production, right? Again, this curve only holds true, the law of returns holds true for a given combination of the other factors of production. We are just considering the relationship between one factor, namely the factor that we vary, and the product, and the overall product. If we increase the other factors of production, we get such an upward shift of the curve representing the impact of our labor. Okay? So what we need to do then is to set aside some time that we do not invest directly into the production of consumer goods, but that we invest into the production of producer goods or factors of production. One example that is a famous example you find in Austrian literature is the example of a fisherman. Okay, the fisherman can, in the most primitive setting, fish the fish with his bare hands. Okay, and let's say you're somebody like me, so it's really an efficient fisher. So you will catch 2 fish, let's say 1 fish in a day. And then after a month or so, right, you get more used to it, you catch 2 fish a day. Now you need, let's say, you need to eat a fish per day in order to survive, which allows you, if you catch 2 fish, to save 1 fish for the next day and do something else, right? And this setting aside of 1 fish that you do not eat immediately, this is called savings. Okay, well, saving is the act of not using consumer goods that is thereby available for other users in the future. Now, the question is, how will I use my time? I can just relax the next day, can take a nice nap or have a nice stroll on the beach, amuse myself, sing songs, look at the birds. And then the third day I'll go again catch fish. Okay, so I'll keep my technology and go on in this way with a hand-to-mouth existence, always catching fish with my bare hand and then having fun the next day, going on. And if we look around, I mean, this way of using savings is fairly common in our day too, right? Some of us are, of course, very thrifty, setting aside their savings, and they're making a different use of this that we will talk about later. And others, well, so they have savings and they use them just the way I described them. They're partying, right? From an economic point of view, there's nothing wrong with this. Right? It would be an ethical judgment to say, well, that's wrong and you need to be thrifty, or the other way around. You shouldn't be thrifty. You should be spending. Right? It's just another way of using one's savings. Now, but what is of course interesting for us is precisely this other way of using savings, which we might call, which the classical economists have called the productive way of consumption, or the productive way of using savings. Namely, rather than stroll on the beach or look at the birds the next day, I can set out to produce another factor of production. For example, I can set out to build a net. Okay, and the net will then allow me to catch not only 2 fish per day, but let's say 7 fish per day, or maybe 17 fish per day. In other words, what we do by this act of savings and then capital accumulation by producing the net is to upward shift the curve of my labor. It's precisely this thing that is going on. Okay. Now, after a while, the net will be broken or needs to be repaired and so on. So in order to maintain what Austrian economists call the total array of capital goods, or the structure of production, okay, we need to reinvest constantly, set aside some time in the and use it for the production of capital goods. We can illustrate this in the following way by a production possibility frontier, a PPF, okay, and let's say I will use this combination here between consumer goods and capital goods, which is just sufficient to replace the capital goods that are being used in the production process. So as a consequence then, I will be able to reproduce this curve all the time. Right? I'll just have the investment in capital goods sufficient to maintain the existing capital structure, so I will be able to constantly remain on this point and enjoy this combination of consumer goods and capital goods. And in particular, I will have then this amount of consumption. Okay, and this is called a stationary economy, economy in which there's no increase, neither decrease. You'll stay at the basic quantitative level of consumption that you've reached before. Now let's consider a second case, which is the case of a growing economy. Now, what we do in a growing economy is, rather than choose this point that I considered before, the point of the stationary economy, I choose a different combination of consumer goods and capital goods. Maybe, for example, this point here. So you see, I reduce my consumption and I increase my savings, my capital accumulation. And as a consequence of this, in the next period, my PPF will shift to the right. Okay? And this is precisely what was going on here. Right? Right? We can have this increase, this rightward shift of the PPF corresponds exactly to this case in which we have this upward shift of the curve of return of my labor. So we have it here in the growing economy. So if we follow through this point, you'll get a shift of the structure of production, a shift of the PPF to the right, and so on for the next period, and so on. All right. So this is the dynamic, the basic dynamic of economic growth propelled by savings and capital accumulation. And finally, we can consider the third case, namely the case of a shrinking economy. So again, we have our reference point, which would be here. And if we now choose a combination to the left of this point that involves more consumption and less capital accumulation, well, then we get the inverse dynamic. Okay, in the next period then, our PPF will have shrunk. And if we persist in the same choice and the same strategy, our PPF will shrink ever more. So it's a process of decivilization or impoverishment. Yeah. So as we see from these basic illustrations of economic mechanisms, right, capital accumulation is very important for, well, economic growth. That's the economic aspect of it, but basically for human civilization. You cannot have no civilization or production of arts, literature, any cultural production if you don't have the means. Cultural production is always a use of savings that takes place, which presupposes that we have enough savings being invested to maintain the existing structure of production. Only then we can set aside things for cultural production. Okay. Now this is not yet very realistic. It's not satisfying. Therefore, we'll have other lectures pertaining to capital and interest and structure of production within this week, which we'll go into more detail. But one basic reason why this is not yet very realistic is because we have so far only considered the case between one consumer goods and one producer's good, the net and the fish. And of course, it's for most people not a very enticing prospect of being able the next day to consume 17 fish. Right? And if we then accumulate more, we'll be able to consume 57 fish, and then 114 or whatever, and finally we'll use the fish to chase birds and do other things, right? No, so the more realistic aspect, the one that finds more illustration in our present situation, is the one in which we have savings not in a primitive economy but in a developed economy. But in order to understand the impact of savings in a developed economy, we need first to consider another basic mechanism of the developed economy, which is the division of labor. So savings that take place under the division of labor have ultimately the same impact, but the concrete mechanism is slightly different. So first we need then to talk about the division of labor. And the division of labor is so the coordination of production plans, right, oriented toward exchange. Right? Now, exchange is one the basic coordination mechanism for the division of labor. So what we do is to coordinate productive efforts. And by and large what we do here, or what we can do, is to consider three different scenarios. The most easy case is the following one, which may be called case 1, in which we have the following situation. So we have two individuals, A and B, and they are both engaged in the production of the two same commodities. And so for each of these individuals, we have a PPF that characterizes his abilities, his present abilities. Right? The PPF can vary in the course of time, for example, under the impact of education, right, or training or whatever. Right? Then PPF might change its form or be shifted to the right and so on. But let's say at any given point of time, the PPF has a certain shape for any individual. And what we see here then is that this individual has a greater facility in producing the first good. Let's say this is the production of guns. He's a great gun maker. And he is comparatively less efficient in producing butter. Whereas for the individual B, it is the other way around. Right? So he is a better butter maker, and he's not that good at gun making. And in the light of his PPF, we might say the cost or the opportunity cost for individual A of gun making is lower than the opportunity cost of gun making for individual B. I'm not sure. Have you been introduced to the concept of opportunity cost this morning? So opportunity cost is the value of the good to which you have to renounce by making your choice. Right? So let's say if I have this individual had produced this combination of guns and butter before, and now he moves up to this combination, okay, then he gains this quantity of guns, and he has to renounce to this quantity of butter that he could otherwise have produced. Okay, and this quantity to which he renounced by the fact of producing more guns is called his opportunity cost. Okay, now it's clear that in the case of A, the opportunity cost of gun making is much smaller than for the individual B. Let's say individual B had before produced such a combination of guns and butter, and now he wants to increase the gun production in the same way as A. He probably has to choose a combination of this sort here. Right? Then he would get a similar result in terms of additional guns being produced. But whereas individual A had just this small amount of butter which he can no longer produce now, our individual B has a great amount of butter to which he has to renounce. And so we say the opportunity cost for B of gun making is much smaller than for A. And the other way around. Right? So I could draw now the same thing. We could look at it from the other point of view. We could say we start here at this position, and individual A now wants to produce a greater amount of butter, so he moves to this position. Right? Then he increases his butter production by this amount, and he reduces his gun production by this amount. Okay. And individual B could start here and increase, would wish to increase his butter production. Then with the same investment, for the same amount of guns to which he has to renounce, he can produce a much greater amount of additional butter, which is equivalent to saying that his opportunity cost of butter making is smaller than for A. And that is, of course, the reason why, or one of the basic reasons why we have a division of labor. Okay? So it is worthwhile for A and B to join forces, right? And for A to specialize in gun making and for B to specialize in butter making. And as a consequence, the overall result of their efforts will be larger than before. Okay? And that's very important because we have here now an economic rationale, economic explanation for the existence of society, for the existence of human cooperation. Of course, it's not the only factor that comes into place. Right? Some people just get together because they're very sociable, because they're nice guys, or because they love other fellow human beings, and so on. But what this economic analysis tells us is that even if all these other factors were lacking, right, if people were to hate one another, they just don't like these other guys who are always of a different opinion, and they're sweating, and the feet stink, and so on, right? Even if this were the case, then they would still have an incentive to get together, and despite all the other reasons that prevent them from cooperating, get together and produce, join their forces. So we have here an economic motor of the formation of society. Now let's consider two other cases. There is the theoretical possibility of a case 2, which is sometimes used in Austrian economics. So in case 2, as you see, it's maybe not immediately obvious, but the PPFs for both individuals are exactly the same. So they are equal, completely equal. And what you find in the Austrian economics literature, this case is referred to as a counterexample to illustrate that inequalities are important in furthering human cooperation and the formation of society. Because it is said that for these two individuals that are completely equal, there is no economic incentive in joining forces. Okay? The incentive that existed in case A is lacking in case B. So far from being an obstacle to the formation of society, inequalities can be a very important motor in the very important economic incentive in bringing about human cooperation. Now there's again a philosophical issue. Can such a thing as case 2, can this exist? Can there be two human beings that are exactly equal in the productive powers? And I do not think that this is actually the case. So I think it's a fictitious case for the simple reason that we do not consider the location of the individuals in time and space. Right? They cannot be at the same point, at the same time, at the same space, point in space. Because they are different necessarily by virtue of being different individuals located at different points in space, there are locational advantages for one individual as compared to the other. Okay, but we don't need to go into this detail. Now let's therefore directly move on to case number 3. And case number 3 is the most interesting one. Case number 3 is the following. We have two individuals that are unequal, but they're not only unequal, there's also one of them is superior to the other in all respects. That's the following case. Okay? So we have individual A that is superior to B in gun making, but also in butter making. Now, given this case, which finds ample illustrations in reality, we often find people who are just better than we are in just everything. The most common case would be small kids, for example. There are few things that parents cannot do better, whatever it be, than their kids, except for crying maybe. And so the question is there division of labor possible in such a case? And for a long time, roughly speaking, until the beginning of the 19th century, virtually all social philosophers have considered that in such a case, no fruitful division of labor is possible. Right? You have the Superman on the one hand, you have the underling on the other hand. Okay? And there's really nothing that B can give to A, because anything is better in all respects. He doesn't need to cooperate with B. So if A cooperates with B or does something for B, well, it's really just an act of mercy. Right? And the least thing that he can expect in exchange is obedience. Okay? So we have here the most common, one of the most common justifications of hegemonical social relations. Right? One type of one race is more superior to the other. Therefore, the underlings owe obedience to the A group because they are so merciful as to do something for B. Now the important thing that economists did, most notably David Ricardo, although he did not develop this point in much detail, was to completely explode this case and to show that even in this case, the most difficult case, there is an economic incentive both, not only for B but also for A, to cooperate with one another. That is, that not only B profits from cooperating with A, but A profits too. So the incentive is again mutual. Let us consider the following case, following example. Oh. So we have two individuals acting separately from one another, so there's not yet any division of labor. And in this scenario, we have so Peter and Paul, both of whom are engaged to facilitate our analysis in the production of the same two goods. And Peter produces rabbits and berries, and Paul produces rabbits and berries too. Right? What does it mean to produce rabbits? Well, of course, he doesn't produce them in the sense of creating rabbits, but he produces them in the sense of transforming nature, right? Getting the rabbit that is running around, roaming in the woods, onto your table, right? In a roasted form, for example. And also get the berries, which you do not produce in a physical sense, right? From the bush into your refrigerator or whatever. So Peter produces then 5 rabbits in 5 hours and 1,000 berries in 5 hours. And we see Paul is inferior to Peter in both respects. In 5 hours he chases just 1 rabbit, as good a hunter as I am, probably better. And 500, he collects 500 berries in the remaining 5 hours. So 10-hour workday, right? We're talking about here Victorian England, not modern Germany. Now the question is, what happens if they join forces? Now it's easy to see, well, what might the division of labor be? If we consider again our diagram, case 3, we see this diagram actually resembles the relationship between Peter and Paul. A is better than B in all respects, but you see that he's particularly good in butter making, whereas B is particularly good in gun making. Right? So A is better in gun making, even in gun making A is better than B, but he's relatively more efficient in butter making. So it is natural that A then tends to specialize in butter making and B tends to specialize in gun making. Now this is exactly what will also happen in our case of rabbits and berries. So after the division of labor, so I've made up one example, it's possible to divide the division of labor in the following way. Paul will no longer chase rabbits, he's really too bad in hunting, so he will give up the hunting job. He completely specialize on berry collecting, plucking. And Peter will devote some more of his time into rabbit hunting, and some less of his time the collection of berries. And now, if we compare the overall production of society before and after the division of labor, so here we had a total of 6 rabbits and 1,500 berries. And here, so after the division of labor, we have a total of 7 rabbits and 1,600 berries. So our society, the true society, different individuals cooperating, is better endowed with all quantities than they would have been if they had not divided labor amongst them. So we get the result from case 1 confirmed, and even stronger confirmed, because if even in the most difficult of all scenarios, in the most improbable of all scenarios, one individual being superior to the other in all respects, there is a fruitful division of labor is possible, then clearly we see that the division of labor is a very, very powerful incentive to create society, to join forces, and to deal with one another, rather than each one remaining in one's cave and painting the walls. So as a last application of this consideration, we can come back on savings in a modern economy, and although this point will be more developed later on, we can anticipate already the result. So what is the impact of savings in a modern economy? Well, savings enable us basically to do the same, right? That is, to engage in additional production processes, only we will not just produce the same thing all over again, right? 17 fish and then 57 fish and 1,040 fish and so on. But savings enable us to engage in other production processes in which we had not been able to engage before, right? And the way it works in a modern economy is not that we set aside a stock of, let's say, fish that we then consume the next day, or stock of berries or of rabbits, and so we put them in the fridge. Right? But what savings do is to restructure the structure of production, the way labor is divided within society. As a consequence of savings, the division of labor will be different. More factors of production will be produced under the division of labor, and less consumer goods. But the overall result is again the same, right? We shift upward our curve, the bottleneck on our labor productivity, or otherwise said, we shift rightward the PPF for social production. So in conclusion then, the economics of production enables us to see, and this is one of the hard pieces of economic analysis, enables us to understand not only the incentives, not only the mechanisms by which productivity can be modified and consciously modified, but it also enables us to understand the emergence of society. It's not just economics, not just about money and prices being paid. It is about understanding a driving force for the emergence of human civilization. And the conditions that sustain human civilization, most notably capital accumulation and peace. Because without peace, no division of labor is possible. I think we have about 2 minutes for questions, so I'll be happy to take any if you have them now. Yep.
In case 3, if the superior producer, if his opportunity costs are proportional to the worsen producer, will they still trade, or does it depend on the difference in efficiency?
Oh yeah, that's an interesting question. Yeah, again, I would in this case, yeah, if it were, so it was not a fictional case, but if really the PPFs had exactly the same shape, only on a different dimension, then there would be no incentive for cooperation. But again, so the question is this a realistic case? Yeah, fine. So.
What about the production of, like, for instance, you use guns, but what about like sophisticated weapons? Might a country produce sophisticated weapons even if they're not that talented at it, and they'd be better off not producing them at all and just trying to trade for it because they're afraid that the other person might come and say take their butter?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, you can the PPFs that we have used, right? You can of course use. I mean, here we put consumption capital. You can put any two goods. It can be sophisticated weapons, basic weapons, right? Because we are just here trying to illustrate the trade-offs that exist. You've got to make up your mind. You've got to make a choice. Because you cannot do everything. You are limited in the amount of total product. That's the basic message. Right? And of course, we do observe this in certain cases. Think of the industry of, let's say, Andorra or Liechtenstein. Okay, heavy concentration on certain industries, most notably related to the financial services and so on, and they're importing all the rest. Right? One of the great concerns of Britain, Professor Rako yesterday mentioned population figures for England from 1750 to 1850. So one of the great concerns of the conservatives in England, so all the aristocracy was, well, how can we feed all our population? Impossible, right? If we exceed the traditional 6 million, we will all starve. But what they did, of course, was to specialize in certain things, cloth making, shipbuilding and so on, and they exchanged this product against the food stuff that they needed to survive. Yeah, of course, this is very common today. Japan could not survive on its agriculture, right? So they're dependent on imports. Germany could not survive on its own agricultural production and so on, many other countries. So one last question. Yeah.
I have a simple question. Suppose person A is better than person B in both gun making and butter making. Don't you think person B should sit at home and just get things from person A?
No, but that's the case that we considered, right?
Yeah, that's you just had it.
Yeah, this is the case 3, or this case here, right? You see Peter is better than Paul in everything. And still what our figures here show is that if they they coordinate their production efforts, they can produce an overall greater amount. Right? So they have 1 additional rabbit and 100 additional berries that can be divided in any mutually agreeable way amongst them. Thank you.
Thank you very much.